Morning, everyone. Welcome to the Integrated Resource Planning Busbar mapping results for the proposed 2024-2025 CAISO TPP portfolios. My name is Nathan Barsick. I'm a supervisor with the Integrated Resource Planning team at the California Public Utilities Commission. As you just heard, this webinar is being recorded. That is mostly for ours and your reference after this is all done. Note or two on scope. So thanks everyone for your participation today. Thanks very much for those of you that authored and submitted comments on November 13th and then replies on December 1st. Just to note that we're still reviewing those. There's a lot of great thoughts in there, and it does take time to analyze and incorporate where necessary that sort of feedback. Also, a reminder that we already showed some initial busbar mapping information in our October workshop. What we're going to try to do here this morning is build on that by focusing on a more detailed walkthrough of busbar mapping, noting that the mapping process is actually still live and that more updates are likely. Why then would we be doing this here and today? We see a lot of value in further developing your understanding of what's going on with mapping, particularly a few things. So first, providing a little more detailed summary of mapping results for the proposed PSP and the proposed base case for the next TPP. Second, to provide more of a description of the environmental and land use analysis implemented in busbar mapping. Third, to provide an overview of identified mapping issues and remapping goals. And fourth, to describe the criteria used for gas resources and some initial mapping info for our proposed high gas retirement sensitivity. Before we get any further into content, I do want to provide my usual caveat and ask of you to please keep the advocacy to a minimum. The point of this webinar today is to promote understanding, especially on your side, regarding a lot of very detailed information. The time and place for advocacy is in comments and replies. What we're trying to do here is get questions from you and raise areas where there could be potential issues that we'd like to hear from you. And we will have some junctures logically over the course of this webinar in which to do that. So a lot of you are probably used to now us in IRP using the Q&A function that's in the lower right hand of your screen. Unfortunately, it's not a Q&A button. You do have to go to the very lower hand right corner of your screen and see the button with the 3 dots. Click on it and then you'll see the Q&A function. That's the preferred way for us to deal with Q&A. Because it provides a written record that we can then post to the website that everyone can search later. But if we do have time, or if it turns out to be more appropriate in certain cases to take verbal questions, we do have a means for doing that. So if we are going to do that, it would be on your side, it would require a couple different actions. So you've all been muted by default. We're sorry about that. But first you would raise your hand. Then one of us as host will unmute you and point at you, and then you can lower your hand after you've asked your question, etc. For those of you that are dialing in by phone and don't have access to the WebEx, you can do the same raise your hand function by pressing *3. And just to note that the Q&A here is going to be pretty important. We're not seeking any sort of written comment after this. We are in a pretty quick turnaround to try to turn this and other information into a proposed decision that can be voted on in the February CPUC voting meeting. So again, we are not going to be taking written comment on this. So please sharpen your pencils for the next few hours. The agenda will be as follows. We've budgeted 3 hours. It's possible we don't need the whole thing, but I don't want to overpromise right now. So we are expecting to be with you through noon today. The introduction, which is almost done, was by me, Nathan. Next, we'll hear a couple sections from Jared Ferguson, who's our busbar mapping lead on IRP. Next, we're actually going to hear from our CEC colleague, Safia Hossainzadeh, regarding land use and environmental analysis used in busbar mapping. Then we'll try to take a break for questions. Then we'll move back to Jared for mapping criteria alignment, potential adjustments, and then he and I are going to try to cover the gas capacity not retained method and information regarding the high gas sensitivity that we're proposing to pass to CAISO for its next TPP. And I think with that, we can hand things over to Jared.
Thanks, Nathan. And Hello, everyone. I'm Jared Ferguson. As Nathan said, I'm an analyst on the IRP team here at the CPUC. And we're going to do in the next few slides here a recap on the proposed portfolios for this cycle's TPP. So the proposed base case is the 25 MMT core portfolio, which is also the proposed PSP portfolio. And this year we'll be transmitting 2 model years and 2 mapped years. The 2034, which is the traditional 10-year projection, and then we're also transmitting 2039 model year, which is a 15-year projection to the ISO. And this figure on the right shows that breakdown of resources selected in this portfolio. This is the core portfolio, so it does have included into it the various LSE plan resources that were submitted in their 2022 November IRP plans. And so you can see in the table at the bottom, we have about 53 gigawatts of storage and new generation in 2034, and about 75 gigawatts of storage and new generation by 2039. And in this portfolio, Resolve does choose to economically not retain about 2 gigawatts of gas retirements. Next slide, please. And we discussed this in the last workshop in October, but I did want to come back to this point because it is a key point, and it does lead to some confusion and difficulties when we're doing comparisons between portfolios. The proposed base case and the previous 23-24 TPP base case portfolio that the ISO is currently setting use a different resource baseline. So the previous 23-24 TPP case used an older baseline that was mostly designed to align with the previous transmission white paper. So that portfolio had a lot of resources included in it that were already online or almost online by the time that portfolio was transmitted to the ISO. And so in the development of the new portfolios, the CPUC did an update of the baseline, which I identified a lot of those online and even contracted resources and got moved into the baseline. So staff has done some analysis and have identified about or over 16 gigawatts of resources that were in the previous TPP portfolio, but are now included in the baseline. So they don't show up in the resource columns of this portfolio. And you can see here on the right, sort of that amount in that second from the left column. So if you adjust the old TPP portfolio down, you can see sort of a more apples to apples comparison with this proposed portfolio. I will note that that those baseline resources we have done some analysis on to keep track of them. It is buried in the dashboard currently, but we are keeping track of those resources for the transmission implications of them as well, particularly those contracted and not online resources in the baseline. We do want to make sure that the ISO has that information of where those resources are located so that they can factor into the ISO's transmission analysis. But even after that work, there is still a size difference in the portfolio, and that, as noted at the bottom here, is staff belief is driven by 3 main things. It's the updated ELCC surfaces, the slightly lower load projections from the newer IPR load forecast from the CEC, and also the fact that we have different resource mixes selected by Resolve in this portfolio with significantly more onshore wind, which generally has higher capacity values than solar, and so less nameplate megawatts get selected. Next slide, please. So over these next few slides, we're sort of just going to run through what Resolve does select, and I have also included in comparisons that updated amount after accounting for the baseline adjustment resources that were in the previous TPP portfolio. So you can see for solar and storage in this proposed portfolio, the big change is the amount of solar. You can see in 2034, Resolve only has about 16 gigawatts of solar selected, while in 2039, it does go up to about 25 gigawatts, but that is still several gigawatts less than what was modeled and mapped in the previous base case. Next slide. And then on the opposing side, this portfolio has significantly more onshore wind resources. You can see that Resolve has, or the portfolio has about 10 gigawatts of onshore by 2039, compared to about just over 2 gigawatts in the previous base case. Likewise, out-of-state wind in 2034 versus in the new in this new proposed portfolio has about about 500 megawatts more, but then that jumps to about 10 gigawatts total, so almost double the previous TPP portfolio's amount of out-of-state wind by 2039. Next slide. This is showing the results for biomass, geothermal, as well as long duration energy storage types that Resolve models. And overall, you have comparable amounts of in-state biomass and geothermal, while you do have less long duration energy storage. You went from about, you have in the proposed base case only about 1 gigawatt in both 2034 and 2039. Next slide. Now I'm going to go through a similar summary about the proposed sensitivity for this year's TPP, and the proposed sensitivity here is the high gas retirement case, and this chart here shows the amount of gas retirements that are occurring in the sensitivity. Note that the base case does have some forced in retirements in addition to the OTC phase outs. The results also assume a phase out in the 2030s of about 1.9 gigawatts of CHP plants. The sensitivity builds on that by retiring between 2028 and 2040, roughly, about 12 gigawatts of additional gas retirements. And I'll note here that though this text here shows how staff came about the amount, the 12 gigawatts amount of retirement. This is not the process by which we are identifying specific gas units to model as retired in the mapping results. That, as Nathan noted, will be discussed at the end of this webinar. Resolve only looks at the system level by technology type, and so this is not looking at individual resources yet. Next slide. So the proposed sensitivity case, you can see here the amount of gas retired by technology type. So you have the forced in OTC and CHP resources that are the same as in the base case. And then you have the additional gas retirements of just under 5 gigawatts in 2034, and then about 10.5 gigawatts in 2039. And I'll note that this sensitivity portfolio, unlike the base case, does not include the LSE planned resources. So it's a fully resolved cost optimized portfolio. So you can see here on the right that resource breakdown of the portfolio both in 2034 and 2039. Next slide. And these next few slides are similar charts comparing the resources in this gas retirement to the proposed base case portfolio. So you can see in 2039, the gas retirement has significantly more solar and storage. It has a little more than double the amount of solar as the proposed base case, and about 3 gigawatts more storage or more battery storage. Next slide. This is the comparison of the wind resources in the sensitivity case to the proposed base case. So you can see it overall has less onshore wind, both in-state onshore and out-of-state wind, and also has no offshore wind in the sensitivity case. Next slide. And on the geothermal and long duration storage, you can see that the gas retirement sensitivity case has significantly more geothermal and long duration energy storage selected by 2039. So now I'm going to go into a discussion on the mapping of the base case portfolio. So next slide, please. But before I get to that, I did want to cover some key terms that are used and I've already used, and I probably should have had this slide beforehand. I think some of the first sort of key term concept here is the difference between in development versus generic resources. I will, throughout this workshop and in the Busbar mapping material, like the dashboard and report, we classify portfolio resources as either in development or generic. And the difference between the two is as follows. In development resources are resources that working group has, the Busbar mapping working group has very high confidence that they will be developed and come online. This includes recently online per project. So our Resolve IRP baseline was developed earlier this year, and so since then we do have resources that have come online. So we want to make sure we're accounting for those in the mapping process. We also want to account for contracted resources not in the baseline as well, and additionally any resources that have been identified as under construction because they might not be identified as contracted by CPUC jurisdictional LSEs, so we don't have that information. So we work with PTOs and the ISO to identify additional potential resources. And then generic resources are just the remaining resources in the portfolio. So if the portfolio in 2034 has 16 gigawatts of solar, we've identified about 6.5 gigawatts of in development resources. So those are either contracted resources and online resources not in the baseline. And we want to make sure that those are accounted for in the mapping process. The remaining 9.5 gigawatts of solar are considered the generic resources that have full flexibility to be optimized through the Busbar mapping process. The next terms and concept I want to add some nuance to is the terminology of in-state versus out-of-state wind that we use. And these are actually now very archaic misnomers because in-state includes several sources of out-of-state wind. And really in-state wind represents wind resources, not just in-state, but also within the existing ISO system. So that specifically refers to resources in the Nevada and Arizona areas of those states that are have transmission systems that are part of the ISO. So in that Southern Nevada, it's the GLWVA system that are currently online and operating as a transmission system. It also includes Baja California, Mexico wind that does interconnect directly to the ISO transmission system in SDG&E territory. Out-of-state wind is another category of resources that we model, and it's not just out-of-state wind. It's specifically out-of-state wind that requires major new transmission out beyond the current ISO footprint. Generally, as well, the out-of-state wind is modeled and resolved as having a distinctly higher capacity factors than the in-state wind resources. And in the current IRP modeling, we have 4 specific categories of in-state wind, which are New Mexico, Wyoming, Idaho, and Utah wind. The last concept I want to point out and is specifically related to the busbar mapping and particularly how it's related, how that mapping is presented in the tables and summaries in the dashboard and supporting material, and that is for out of ISO resources. So resources, like in Idaho, in New Mexico, in the Imperial Valley, and interconnecting to the IID system, are mapped to the likely intertie point with the ISO. So for example, in this base case, we've mapped a lot of the geothermal in the Salton Sea area as interconnecting to the ISO through the Mirage intertie up in the Riverside area. And so in the summaries, it will often show the geothermal as mapped to Mirage. So that's not saying we think the geothermal is going to be deployed in that part of the count of Riverside, but it's where it is interconnecting to the ISO system. And one other point is that we do, for these out of ISO resources, we do distinguish if they are going to need in ISO transmission needs as well, and that is helping to identify whether the out-of-state resources are MIC expanding or not at that intertie. Next slide. And then the sort of the second summary point is this mapping update does not include a significant remapping of resources yet. We're still implementing that process. We're wanting to fully complete the review of ruling comments and replies and incorporate that into the remapping process as well. This analysis presented here does include a fair amount of tweaks and adjustments as we've been working through the initial results and assessing how to remap things. We've implemented several updates, fixes, and changes. A few of those are additional analysis of things that we hadn't been able to implement fully for that preliminary mapping release in October. That includes a few of the criteria analysis laid out in the busbar mapping methodology, such as calculating and determining expected distance to interconnection points, and analysis, as well as the land use and environmental analysis for geothermal resources in state. We've also updated the interconnection or the commercial interest criteria to factor in commercial interest from other interconnection queues, as well as the cluster 15 application CPUC as well. We've also been working with ISO staff to review and check the constraint and substation information from the recent 2023 white paper. So there's been several constraint adjustments we've made through either the capacity limits of existing constraints or the capability, the amount of megawatts certain upgrades could provide. And so we've been working with ISO to have the constraint and substation information, transmission information better align with what this system is actually showing. And finally, also have been working on fixing some of the calculations and data sources that feed into the mapping analysis. For example, we had for a lot of the wind resource analysis in the preliminary results, we were using 2 different base resource potential data sets, and that's something we can get to. That's actually factoring into an ongoing analysis with respect to when use that we will be talking about a little bit later. Next slide, please. So this is a pair of tables showing the 2034 mapping results and 2039 mapping results by ISO interconnection area. So it's talked about this on the previous workshop, and throughout this presentation, I try to show both some summaries by IRP's traditional resolve resource regions, but also the ISO interconnection areas. So you can see how these 2 sort of ways of dividing the state are both similar but different. So this is sort of showing that mapping summary by the interconnection areas. Next slide. This is the summary at the bottom of this by the resolve resource areas. You can see the breakdown in the bar chart. And additionally, we have the spatial mapping by substation of where the resources are located. Excuse me. Next slide. These next 2 slides are sort of some of the high-level issues where we're seeking to address through this ongoing remapping process. And one of the bigger issues is consistency with the previous base case, because as I was saying earlier, we do have a significantly different, not a different portfolio than that was passed last cycle. And that's not saying that change is wrong and correct. We have to do the additional analysis to assess what is driving that change. For example, if it's a change in demand forecast or cost shifts or something, or other exogenous factors, those are essentially a necessary part of the annual cycle that is this long-term planning. However, other changes that are arising from, knife edge modeling assessments that are within margins of errors are ones that do potentially warrant remapping for more consistency and better alignment. And the chart here on the right shows the comparison between the previous TPP and this mapped proposed base case of the 2034 results. So you can see it is a year earlier, but still there is, in a lot of locations, there are less resources mapped. And as you'll see in some later analysis, and you can tell from the charts itself, that it is primarily driven by the fact that there is significantly less solar in this portfolio. Next slide. So this is the same chart, but now with 2039. The left column in each grouping is the proposed base case, while the right column is the 23-24 TPP. And so you can see in the 2039 portfolio, the overall differences have evened out a bit. In most locations, you have a comparable or even more resources mapped, since it is looking 15 years out. You do still have differences in resources type. So like in the SCE Eastern area, so Riverside and into Arizona, you have a comparable amount of resources, but you have about 2 gigawatts less solar and 2 gigawatts more out-of-state wind that is interconnecting in the area. So those kind of differences will often result in the same or in similar transmission needs, but not always the exact same transmission needs. So this is part of, as we're going through remapping, trying to assess what are the transmission implications of the portfolio changes. Next slide. So as sort of talking about that, this portfolio has roughly 3 times the amount of in-state wind that we've previously mapped. So that's led to us looking at sort of places in the state that we haven't mapped before. Specifically, get into more detail, we're looking at the east side of the Sierras as a potential location to site some of those resources, but there's significant transmission implications and environmental criteria implications as well. And as Nathan noted earlier, we are still looking through and reviewing comments and replies to the PSP ruling, and just noting that there was feedback in those comments and replies that IRP assumptions are overestimating wind potentials in certain areas. Just showing there in the small table in the middle that you do have sort of that comparison of, in the TPP we had about 3,000 megawatts we mapped, and now we are looking at 8,000 and 10,000 megawatts to map. An additional note with the mapping of this in-state wind is we've, in our criteria analysis, we've been noticing that we are having substation areas where we have identified commercial interest, but we see little to no base resource potential for onshore wind. And do note that we know our resource potential for wind base layer does have some resolution limitations. So we are considering looking at a lower capacity factor threshold. So we've been, as we've discussed in previous workshops, have a techno-economic base resource potential layer, and we have a cutoff of a 28% capacity factor. And so staff are looking at, particularly in locations where we have identified commercial interests, lowering that capacity factor to see if we can identify potential wind locations that our base data layer is missing. I'll note that this process, we're not relaxing the environmental or land use criteria. We're just looking at that capacity factor difference to see if there's any locations with resource potential. Next slide. Another overall focus is on the amount and locations of out-of-state or out of ISO resources that are in the portfolio. So we have the geothermal resources. We do have we have mapped some resources in the geysers area And then we have some resources in central Nevada, which we map as interconnecting directly to the ISO in the VEA GLW system in southern Nevada. But the rest of the geothermal resources are located either in IID or northern Nevada and Utah. And what we're seeing for northern Nevada and Utah resources is that the closest interties have very limited import capacity. So that the two import interties on the California and Nevada area up north are Summit and Silver Peak, and those have very low import capacities and would likely require major upgrades. While on the sort of eastern side of Nevada and Utah, you have the IPP system, which does have some ISO scheduling points, but ISO does not have operational control, so it's difficult to expand the amount that can come into there. And then you do have the southern Nevada area, which has transmission capacity and import capacity from transmission expansion, but you then require either wheeling or additional new transmission to get the resources to those points. So we're trying to identify what's the busbar mapping staff think are the ideal cost-effective points of interconnection, or if those resources should maybe be remapped to other locations. With respect to out-of-state wind, we have, as I said, we have about the same amount that was looked at in the 20-year outlook. So we have about 10 gigawatts by 2039. And the key issues we're looking at here is the for lack of a better term, I put in here is the lumpiness of new transmission, in that, if you can't build essentially half of a transmission line. So we're looking at sort of what locations to map to that would fully utilize identified transmission lines and their potential cost. An additional issue, particularly in 2039, is that we have all 10 gigawatts of that out-of-state wind interconnecting to Southern California in interties, either in the El Dorado, Harry Allen area or down at the Palo Verde intertie. And so we need to do further investigation of sort of, is that the best approach for those interties? In the first 20-year outlook the ISO did, they included in their analysis a potential new line from the Wyoming area that would interconnect into Northern California. So that's something we are continuing to look at during this remapping process. And then lastly, back to the in-state wind, looking at mapping some of that in-state wind to, like I said, that eastern side of the Sierras, where we do see commercial interest in the Nevada energy queue. So that would require, either wheeling it to an existing ISO intertie or assessing the cost of long gen ties or new transmission expansion to potentially interconnect those areas. So we have a fair amount of issues we are trying to address in the remapping process for these out-of-state or these out-of-ISO resources. Next slide. The last overarching focus is a key one of what transmission constraints we are exceeding, and sort of what are the transmission upgrade implications. So as I was saying, we've been working with ISO staff to better implement the new white paper constraints. We've gone from about 40 constraints to about 104 constraints, with actually some additional constraints now we're trying to incorporate. So we've been going back and forth with ISO staff to assess sort of the accuracy and how best to implement those constraints. I'll note that in our mapping results, we have 16 constraint exceedances in the 2034 and 27 constraints in the 2039 mapping results. And if you're going back and forth between the October workshop, you'll note that those amounts are slightly lower than in the October workshop, and that's not because we've performed remapping of the resources yet. That's actually because we've identified several changes in the transmission constraints that eliminated some of those exceedances. We have several exceedances that are relatively small exceedances, but the identified upgrade is a large, expensive upgrade. So we are assessing if that upgrade is really necessary potentially, or if it's best to remap those resources to a location that has a more cost-effective upgrade or still existing transmission capacity. And then the sort of the last issue that's a big 2039 issue in particular is that we have a few areas where we are actually significantly exceeding the transmission capacity of even the upgrade. So we have to look at what are the potential transmission implications to that. Is it another upgrade on top of the existing or the identified upgrade, or is it sort of an amount that that proposed upgrade could likely handle? Next slide. So this section has a lot of slides, but it's mostly there for stakeholder convenience. I see Nathan pop on, so I'm wondering if you want to intercede and maybe stop to answer some questions or.
Well, more just process stuff and some clarity that I think we should provide to just help out folks in the Q&A. And I think one question that came from Ellen that I think is reflective of a couple of the comments is just a little bit more clarity on where we are in our process. So I mentioned near the top that our busbar mapping process is still live and ongoing, and that further changes can happen, and that we're also still digesting the November 13th and December 1st comments and replies and deciding what to do with them. So all that's to say is that this is the actual mapping that you will see at the end is still a work in progress. We're not there yet. There's a question from Ellen on slide 19, Jared, that's a little bit of kind of definitions that are up this same alley of, does our recent mapping mean the same thing as preliminary mapping as used earlier in this process, like we were workshopped on October 20th?
Yeah, I would say so. I would say sort of the preliminary mapping, if you are familiar with the busbar mapping process, we often refer to it as rounds of mapping. The preliminary mapping, as we titled it and released during the workshop, was after round one of mapping. What we're at this point right now is, I'd sort of say, round 1.5, where we are done sort of the analysis, and you'll see later in that workshop sort of the summary of that analysis. And so we've identified sort of the issue areas and are looking at and have some ideas on how to address those issue areas, but haven't fully implemented that process yet. So once we sort of decide, sort of, as I said, like, is this criteria alignment good enough, or is there a better place to map? So we sort of at the point of, we've assessed this criteria alignment. Now we need to figure out where to map it to as an alternative location. So I would say this is round 1.5 of mapping, what we're at right now.
So thanks for that, Jared. I think to summarize, it's still a work in progress. Thank you for the input that we're getting live in the Q&A. And I think a little bit more clarity and some justice for the other panelists that we have up here. The folks that I introed at the top were presenters, but we also have about a half dozen other people here for Q&A. So those in the Q&A that will be getting answers from folks that haven't been introduced yet, let me introduce them. So from CEC, we already introduced Sophia, who will be talking in a few minutes. We also have her colleague, Erica Brand, with us. Thank you, Erica. From CAISO, we have Nebu Yimer, who might help with a couple of the TPP focused questions in the Q&A. From the CPUC, we also have David Withrow from the IRP team. And from the consultant side, we have a few folks from E3, Sam Schreiber and Femi Sawyer, as well as from Montera Mountain Energy, we have Emily Wesley. So with that, just have patience with us in the Q&A. There's a lot of good things coming in there. Some of it might take a little bit longer than even today's meeting to answer, so we just ask some patience up front with that, but we're going to do our best to get to everything before noon. I think I can hand things back to you, Jared. I think you're on mute.
Double muted. Thanks, Nathan. So this section has a lot of slides that I'm going to skip through relatively quickly because it's mostly has comparison tables that are added for just ease of looking at the data for us and for stakeholders, sort of showing, as I was saying earlier, like the summary differences of resources mapped to areas by the resolve resource region and by the ISO interconnection zones. So I will be skipping through some of these slides that are just showing the same results, just presented in a slightly different organization between the resolve resource area and the interconnection zone. With that, we can go to the next slide. So this is showing that sort of the resources by region. So we have in the Northern California region is here, and I won't go into details about what has been mapped to this area, just sort of showing the totals in development and generic in both 2034 and 2039, as well as showing the what resolve portfolio had. So you can see where we shifted resources to better align with our Busbar mapping criteria. And I'll just note that this Northern California resolve region corresponds mostly to the north of Greater Bay and Greater Bay areas of the interconnection zones. Next slide. This is sort of that same chart just presented by those interconnection zones. And so I will skip to the next slide. So sort of the key resource mapping results I just want to highlight is as I was noting earlier, the amount of in-state wind. So we have in Northern California area about 3 gigawatts, and mapped to sort of 3 locations. You have, as I was saying earlier, that Lassen and Modoc County locations. You have about 880 megawatts to substations in that northern Sacramento Valley area. And then you have a comparable amount in that Solano Altamont area. And I do apologize that those arrows for those last 2 are pointing to the wrong locations. We have Solano Altamont bullet point pointing to the Sacramento Valley, and then vice versa. I apologize for that. And then the last thing I want to note is that we have about 120 megawatts of new geothermal mapped to the geysers geothermal area. Next slide. And this is sort of just noting the summaries of that we have about 600 megawatts of utility scale solar mapped to 4 substations in this Northern California area. Next slide. This is a comparable summary for the southern PG&E area, so both the San Joaquin Valley and also the Central Coast, and this corresponds to the PG&E, Fresno, and Kern zones. I do note here that it's mostly because do have, for example, 1 or 2 substations that are in that Monterey County, Salinas on south area that are transmission-wise a part of the Bay Area, but we have it mapped and in resolve as part of the southern PG&E area. So there are sort of those small parts where you have those awkward overlaps between interconnection zones and the resolve resource regions. Next slide. We can skip this one. And just noting here that we have about 650 megawatts of in-state wind mapped to 5 different substations in the Central Valley area and on this Central Coast area. And we have the 4.5 gigawatts of offshore wind all mapped to Morro Bay resource area. And you have it here, you show it as 2 dots because we've mapped it as interconnecting both to the Diablo Canyon substation, but also a proposed new 500 kV Morro Bay substation. So they're split with a little more of the resources being mapped to the new proposed Morro Bay substation. So that's the slightly larger circle of the two. And then most of the solar and storage are mapped along the western side of the San Joaquin Valley. Next slide. This is a comparable summary for the two resolve regions of the greater Tehachapi and the LA metro area. I'll note that the greater Tehachapi corresponds to the, I guess, say the northern half of the SCE northern area, while the greater LA metro region and resolve corresponds to the SCE metro zone, and then that southern half of the SCE northern zone. Next slide. You can skip that slide. I'll point out that the Tehachapi area does include a few locations that are actually in the Central Valley. They're a part of the SCE transmission system that's north of Magundan, and we do have some solar and storage mapped to that area. In the Tehachapi area, we also have about 800 megawatts of in-state wind, and then a significant amount of solar and co-located storage at Wind Hub, Whirlwind, Antelope, and Vincent substations in the more standard Tehachapi area. And lastly, we have about 480 megawatts of long duration energy storage mapped to the Whirlwind substation. Next slide. In the LA metro area, we have a small amount of utility scale solar and some distributed scale solar, which for resolve in our mapping purposes is basically at that a few megawatts that represents, commercial scale rooftop up to community scale infill solar. And then the LA metro area also includes about 2.9 gigawatts by 2039 of battery storage mapped to the area. Next slide. So for the greater Kramer resolve region or area, it corresponds to the SCE north of Lugo interconnection zone. I'll note that at this area does include the potential out-of-state interties at the Silver Peak existing intertie, but we generally sort of map those resources to the control substation in that area. Next slide. So in the greater Kramer area, we have about 650 megawatts of in-state wind, and then we have the roughly by 2039, 2 gigawatts of solar and 1 gigawatt of storage mapped to 6 substations throughout the greater Kramer area. Next slide. For the southern Nevada and El Dorado resolve area or region, this corresponds to the east, the ISO's east of Pisgah zone, and it, like the greater Kramer area, includes the interconnection points for potential out-of-state resources. And so you can see sort of listed here, we have both Idaho wind and Wyoming wind mapped in this zone, because we are mapping them as interconnecting to the Harry Allen El Dorado system. Next slide. And that's what I just noted. We have about 2 gigawatts or 2.2 gigawatts in 2034, and then almost 5 gigawatts in 2039 of Wyoming wind, and then about 1 gigawatt and a little bit more in 2039. As I noted earlier, this is sort of the locations and interconnection points of these out-of-state wind resources is an ongoing analysis in this remapping effort. Next slide. We have just under 2 gigawatts of in-state wind mapped to this Southern Nevada area, and it's mapped to 4 substations, 3 in that GLWVEA area in Southern Nevada, and then one substation, sort of the 500 kV Mojave substation down on the Nevada-Arizona border. We also have 500 megawatts of Central Nevada geothermal, and it is mapped as interconnecting to the Beatty substation within the ISO system, but do note that this resource would require a long, significant gen tie to interconnect. We also have out of ISO resources from Northern Nevada and Utah currently mapped to the El Dorado substation, though as I noted earlier, we are still assessing what are the optimal interties for those resources. And then lastly, we have a significant amount of solar and co-located storage mapped to both the GLWVEA system and the Mojave substation as well. Next slide. So for the Resolve Riverside and Arizona areas, these correspond mostly to the SCE Eastern area, but we also have a few Arizona substations that are listed under the SDG&E study area. So those are Hoodoo Wash and Hassayampa that are lumped into these Resolve resource regions here. It also includes the out-of-state interconnection point of Palo Verde, which is where we've mapped the out-of-state wind coming in from New Mexico. Next slide. This is showing that breakdown of resources for that SCE interconnection zone, or SCE Eastern interconnection zone, and then the SDG&E zone. Next slide. So in addition to that New Mexico wind that we have currently all interconnecting at the Palo Verde point, we also have solar and co-located storage mapped in the Riverside area to Red Bluff and Colorado River. And then in the Arizona area, we have it mapped to Delaney, Hoodoo Wash, Hassayampa, and then the proposed new substations on the DCRT line. We also have the 740 megawatts of geothermal mapped to the Imperial area, specifically the Salton Sea geothermal area. We have that as interconnecting to the ISO at the Mirage intertie point. So, the Mirage into Devers intertie in the SCE Eastern area. And then we also have some standalone storage at substations in the western side of the Riverside area. Next slide. And then the last and southernmost area of this travel down the state are the Greater Imperial and San Diego areas. And these two areas correspond to most of the SDG&E interconnection zone. And it does also include the intertie point of Imperial valley with the IID system. So we can have and do have some geothermal in the Imperial area interconnecting at Imperial Valley into the ISO. Next slide. So sort of as I was noting, while we have most of the geothermal in that Salton Sea area, we do have 50 megawatts of geothermal mapped to the East Brawley known geothermal area down in southern Imperial that is interconnecting to the ISO system at Imperial Valley. Next slide. And in addition to the geothermal, we have about 2.8 gigawatts of in-state wind, and most of that, about 2.3 gigawatts, is mapped to Baja California, Mexico wind that we have commercial interest for in the ISO interconnection queue, and that interconnects directly to the East County substation area. We have about 500 megawatts of in-state wind in the greater Imperial area and San Diego area on the California side of the border as well. We also have about 500 megawatts of long duration energy storage mapped to the Sycamore Canyon substation in the SDG area. And then we have about 850 megawatts of battery storage mapped to the San Diego area. And that next slide wraps up the sort of quick walkthrough of where the resources are mapped to and sort of what locations and then I will be turning it over to Nathan here to run this transition better than I'm currently doing.
Sorry to keep interrupting, Jared. I think just a little bit more framing for kind of universally applicable questions that we're seeing. So in response to your clarification verbally that you made a few minutes ago to Ellen's question about, is this V 1.0 or is this V 1.5 that we're showing here? We're showing V 1.5, right?
Sorry, can you repeat that? My dogs just started barking really loudly as you said that.
That's okay. Thank you for sparing us. Given your verbal clarification in the last Q&A section regarding what version of the mapping we're showing here, you mentioned V 1.0 and V 1.5. Ellen was looking for some clarity on which one are we showing here.
Yeah, so I guess sort of to that point these locations are what was also seen in the dashboard that was released with the October workshop. So sort of the mapping locations gets updated sort of at 1 and then at 2. And so that's what I say with the 1.5 estimate is we're identifying where the issue areas are, where we may need to remap from, and also where we could remap to. And so that sort of run through was where things are, and we're gonna have Sophia have a pre-presentation on the more in-depth environmental and land use analysis, and that's going to then segue nicely into having a summary of what are the criteria issues with where things are and potential solutions of where to remap things to. And that will follow after Sophia's presentation. So this was sort of the setup of where things are. And then at the end of this workshop, we'll have sort of where we're thinking about remapping things to.
So Ellen and others, if that's still lacking clarity, please just let us know in the Q&A and we could provide more. Otherwise, I think we can turn things over to our colleagues at the CEC.
Thank you. All right. Hi, everyone. All right. So yeah, I think you can see my screen. Hi, everyone. I'm Sophia Hosanzadeh, and I'm from the CEC, the Siting, Transmission, and Environmental Protection Division. And I'll be talking to you about CEC's role in the busbar mapping process. So we're evaluating the environmental and land use conditions relevant to the required renewable resources that will be studied in the TPP. And so, as you know, busbar mapping is the process of downscaling resolution resolve. These locations are identified by substations that are relevant to the California.
Sophia, just noting your audio for me is going in and out.
Okay. Yeah, so just giving an overview, the busbar mapping is the process of downscaling a coarse resolution resolve portfolio to plausible input locations on the electric grid. These locations are identified by existing or proposed substations that are relevant to the California ISO for their transmission planning. So to evaluate the land use and environmental conditions of the possible locations for the future projected renewable resources, we analyze the area around a substation using explicit geospatial data sets that the CEC has used for statewide energy planning. And the substations that we perform this analysis on are shown here on the right. So in this talk, I'll show how we perform this land use evaluation, what data sets we rely on, and I'll share the land use and environmental metrics for substations that were selected in the preliminary busbar mapping result from the latest dashboard that was released after the last October workshop. And I'll show how the metrics influence the final criteria alignment levels that help determine the mapping that will be studied in the TPP. And just as a check, are you guys hearing me okay, or am I still going in and out?
Coming in perfectly. Thanks, Sophia.
Okay, so this slide defines some key terms that I'll be using throughout this presentation, and it's for your reference. So as mentioned in the outline, we'll draw from the CEC's past efforts in energy planning on the characteristics of the area around each substation as part of our geospatial.
You're coming in and out again. I wonder if it's your proximity to computer.
Okay. So the core land use screen was recently updated by the CEC to identify areas of the state with the most suitability for consideration for utility scale renewable energy generation. Staff reviewed recent statewide assessments on the land designations, physical characteristics, and natural and working lands priorities to identify a number of categories of land areas that would present higher levels of constraints if considered for the renewable energy generation. So these areas would be screened out in this land use screening process to provide a more reasonable estimate of the amount and statewide distribution of resource potential for modeling and planning efforts. And so this is referred to as the core land use screen, and it's shown here in this figure on the right for solar resources. And this category of so basically the way we summarized all of this spatial information about the land use, about the land and environmental conditions, as we categorized these exclusions into the categories you see here: the base exclusions, the biological planning priorities, high intactness, and high cropland areas for solar. And you can review a description of all of these categories and data layers in the land use screens report that the CEC released earlier this year. And we have an accompanying data viewer to help elucidate these data sets further. And one other thing I'll note, this was developed for the SB 100 study, or it was updated for the SB 100 upcoming report. And so we have limited this analysis to within the geographic boundaries of California. So all of the geospatial analysis that I'll be reporting on are limited to within the state of California. And so basically these data sets that we developed and reviewed for the core land use screen development have been used here in the Busbar mapping process. So for Busbar mapping, we perform a geospatial evaluation to describe the constraints that a possible build out of the renewable energy might face in the area around a substation. So we first have to define that area of analysis around the substation. And we do this first by creating a buffer area around each substation. Then we calculate a series of metrics within that within that area of analysis of the substation. So to do that, first we remove the protected area layer and the techno-economic exclusion layer. And that's drawn here in this figure in the green and pink. And this is kind of just looking at this example area of Balota substation. And so the area that remains after removing those two exclusion layers, which also are part of the base exclusions category of the previous slide in the description of the core land use screen components. So when we remove those areas, we're left with the tan area, and that's the total resource potential area. And that's the area of analysis that we use to calculate all of the environmental and land use feasibility metrics for Busbar mapping. And so to do that, we calculate using geospatial analysis a series of metrics. Like I said, one of the most important metrics is calculating the area of low and high implication land area within the total resource potential area. So low implication land is the area remaining outside of the core land use screen, and high implication land is the area that's defined by the core land use screen, and it represents areas that are likely to face higher constraints for renewable energy development. And for many of the other calculations that we perform will depend on intersecting the spatial data sets of these additional variables, like high environmental variables or cropland or fire threat, into the total resource potential area to get the total magnitude of those variables within our study area. So this will help us to just understand the conditions of this landscape around each substation further. And then finally, so once we've got all of our environmental and land use metrics calculated, finally, in order to understand the ultimate level of alignment, we'll be comparing those values to the amount of capacity that's allocated to this region to understand if the substation can support the megawatts that are being considered for this area. Okay, so just to go in a little bit more depth into the types of metrics that we calculate in this analysis. So first, our first group of metrics kind of center around the land use implications and the feasibility of the area to support renewable utility scale renewable generation. So the quantitative factors that we'll be assessing are listed here. First, we have the overall land use feasibility based on the core screen. So this depends on partitioning the total resource potential area into the high and low implication area. Then we have parcelization, and parcelization is a measure of the number of unique parcels within a half-mile radius of a location. And it gives an indication of the parcel size and density of the area. And it's an important land use characteristic for the solar development feasibility of an area. And for parcelization, we have 3 factors that we calculate within the total resource potential area. We report on the total area and the percent coverage of the low and medium levels of parcelization within the study area. And we also report on the 10th percentile value. And then cropland and fire threat are the 2 other factors we look at in this category, in this metrics group. So we report out on the total acreage of both high and low cropland value in the area, and also fire threats tiers 2 and 3, and also the sum of both of those, just to give the total area of potential constraints from these factors. So this image here on the slide just shows kind of the spatial, like visually how that first metric, the land use feasibility criteria based on the core land use screen, how that kind of is shaped, or how that turns out visually. So in tan, you see the total resource potential area. Again, that's the area when you remove the protected area layer and the techno-economic exclusion layer. And then overlaid on top of that is the low implication area, defined by the areas outside of the core land use screen. So this is the area that we want, this would be the area that would face lower constraints if the renewable generation would be built there, as defined by our core land use screen. Okay, so our next group of metrics is the environmental impact factors metrics group. And this focuses on like the conservation and biological conditions of the area around the substation. And we rely on many of the data sets that make up the core land use screen to make up these variables in this group. So when we do the geospatial analysis, we find the total area of intersection of each of these variables listed here within the within the total resource potential area. So that's what you see in this figure. The tan area is that total resource potential area, and the area in gray is the high connectivity variable. So if we intersect those 2 map layers, we'll get the amount of connectivity within the amount of high connectivity within the total resource potential area. And so doing that for each of these variables will help us determine, the magnitude of these variables within our study area, within the area we're trying to map the resources to. And again, this just clarifies and elucidates for us what the landscape conditions are around the substation. And so this slide just lists all of the data sources that our metrics rely on. So you can view them and peruse them to get a better understanding of how they touch down on the ground. So for geothermal resources, the land use and environmental evaluation is conducted within the geothermal fields themselves. And we use the core land use screen to define the areas of high and low implication. And we use the same individual components of the core land use screen to calculate our geospatial metrics within these areas. So all of the environmental variables that I listed before are used to inform on what are the conditions within these geothermal fields that, the development of this renewable resource would likely face in terms of constraints. And the information then from those geothermal fields, the land use and environmental evaluation from within the geothermal fields helps to inform on the substations nearby to see if they can support an adequate amount of capacity. And in the busbar mapping dashboard results, like Jared mentioned, this might be the actual total capacity from like this region, especially here in Imperial County. It'll be off, it might be summarized to like the Mirage substation or the Imperial Valley substation as the intertie points. But whereas like the geysers, we might specifically be looking at the substations in order to understand which, you know, to make that link between the geospatial and environmental evaluation and the substations that can support it. Okay, so next we'll look at a few examples to just see how the land use and environmental analysis was calculated and how it translates into a final alignment level. So these examples, they're taken from the latest busbar mapping preliminary that was released for the 2039 base case portfolio. The results are drawn from, I've linked to the dashboard and also the specific sheets within that dashboard that these results are coming from. So first we have Olive Substation. Now Olive Substation was selected for 40 megawatts to be allocated here, and its final area of assessment was based on a 5-mile radius. So that's what you see here in the figure. And at the table at the top shows all of the criteria alignment levels for each of the land use and environmental factors that you can find in the busbar mapping dashboard. And the image on the left shows a visual of what this area of analysis can look like when using the geospatial data sets that I described above. The protected areas and the techno-economic exclusion layers have been removed, and the areas that are left are in the color. So the white areas are the protected area and techno-economic exclusion areas, and they've been omitted from our analysis for any. So all of the subsequent metrics evaluations are performed in the colored area of this figure. And you know, the light tan area and the dark area together form that total resource potential area. And that is reported in the busbar mapping dashboard and in the list of metrics that we supply to the CPUC as a very fundamental calculation.
Sophia, sorry to interrupt. Just have a question from the Q&A. Might be a little bit more universal of which substations are you referring to in these last few slides? And are they specific real world ones or representative in some way?
Oh, like in these example slides? Well, we perform this geospatial land use and environmental calculation on all, like, there's about like 300 substations that have been identified in the last 2 CAISO white papers on the transmission constraints. So that's where we've identified these about 300 or so substations that we've performed these metrics on. But then all these visuals have been just for one example substation of Belota.
Got it. And I think Kate Kelly's more specific follow-up since you started responding is specifically where is Olive Substation?
Okay, yeah, good question. That is in the eastern part of the Central Valley. So it's in this SPG&E resolve modeling zone. And it's in the eastern side of the Central Valley. I can't really define better than that where it is. I'd have to look at a map, but I can get you that information. Or
I think that'll do for now. Thank you.
So yeah, so yeah, we're looking at all of substation. 5-mile buffer radius defines our area of analysis, and we will report out on the total resource potential area to the CPUC, and then also the low implication area. And so that's the low implication area is fundamental to the core screen criteria alignment level. And that's what I'll go through here. This and the high connectivity or the ACE connectivity criteria to just describe like how the metrics that we calculate get translated into the criteria alignment level score. So so as you can see here, the total resource potential acres is about 26,000 acres. The low implication acres is about 9,000 acres. And so from these raw results of these geospatial calculations, we also have to include the amount of megawatts that's being considered to be mapped to this area in order to get these final alignment level scores. So for the core screen criteria alignment level, for example, we would take its level of alignment would be determined by how much area the capacity that we're considering to be mapped to this area, how much of the low implication land area does it take up. So in this case, the 40 megawatts using a 10 acre per megawatt capacity density would give us about 400 acres. And that 400 acres is a very small fraction of that 9,000 acres of low implication land. And remember, this low implication land area is the area that is defined by the core land use stream to have the least amount of constraints facing it for utility scale renewable energy. So because of that alignment level score is minimal at 1. If we look at another of the metrics that we would report on, which would be like one of the environmental metrics we see here for connectivity, the area of high connectivity within the total resource potential area is about 13,000 acres, or it actually amounts to 49% of the total resource potential acres. So we look at that percentage value and the amount of area that the resource build would take up in the low connectivity areas to determine its alignment level. So so here the percentage of the high connectivity acres is 49% of the total resource potential area. And so because it's less than 50%, which is the limit for the criteria alignment level, and because the total percentage that the allocated capacity would take up of the low connectivity acres is minimal, the criteria alignment level for this substation would be a 1. So many of the other environmental factors are treated in a similar way, and so we can determine the alignment levels that way. So if we look at our next example substation, the Kramer substation, this substation we've kind of shared. We've used it as an example before in past workshops, but it's a substation that has a lot of constraints facing it. As you can see in the image on the left, where we can see the total resource potential area, in the area around this substation, there's a lot of military lands and restricted BLM lands. So really you're only given that like northwest quadrant of land area with any amount of with the total resource potential. Everything else has been excluded from the protected area layer and techno-economic exclusion layers. And so our geospatial analysis shows us that there's actually about 67,000 acres of total resource potential there. And this is looking at a 15-mile buffer around Kramer. So that's what ended up being used for the mapping criteria for this substation. And so of that 67,000 acres, there's only about 7,000 of low implication area. So again, we have to look also at the capacity now that's being considered to be generated from this area, and that's about 13,000 acres worth of capacity. And so this exceeds the amount of low implication area. And so that already will be raising its criteria alignment level to an exceedance flag. But we also have to look at how much of the surplus area of that capacity allocated, how much of that area would need to be built essentially in the higher implication land. So when we perform that calculation, it ends up, that remaining about 6,000 acres would need to be mapped in the high implication area. That's less than 10%. So overall, the criteria alignment level is given a 4 for this metric. And when we look at the high connectivity factor here, it's given an alignment level of 2. And that, when you look at the geospatial analysis that would be provided to get that end result, you can see here in this figure on the right, the area in gray is the high connectivity area. And it actually takes up over 50% of the total resource potential area. And the acreage of the capacity that we're planning to allocate to this region would take up about 1/3 of the low connectivity acres. So those two considerations combined would combine to give the alignment level a score of 2. So those are kind of the factors that we're considering in this geospatial analysis to determine the mapping. So in this third and final example of a specific substation, here we'll look at Devers substation. And the preliminary busbar mapping results allocated about 500 megawatts here. But as you can see in the table up at the top, it's raised a lot of exceedance flags. So Devers is located east of Riverside near the Coachella Valley, near the northern part of the Coachella Valley. And the protected area layer, specifically the BLM lands, have removed a large portion of this area from consideration. And the techno-economic exclusion layers are also a considerable driver of the limited land area available for this resource generation here. So that's what you can see. So that produces this image on the left, where I'm showing the total resource potential. And overlaid on top of that in the darker blue is the low implication land area. And the total acreages of each of these components is shown in the table here on the slide. as well as the high connectivity acres. And that's visually shown in the image on the right. So you can see the overlap of that environmental factor, as well as the two main factors that go into the coarse grain criteria alignment. The coarse grain criteria alignment calculation. So just to walk through kind of the logic behind determining these scores, again, so we have to look at the allocated capacity that's being considered for this region. And so this is about 20,000 acres. It's about 500 megawatts, but we use a 40 acre per megawatt capacity density to convert it to give a rough estimate of the amount of area that would be needed to produce this generation. And, you know, because of just the limited resource potential available, that 20,000 acres or so, you know, greatly exceeds the amount of low implication land available. So if we were to map the resources here, it would take up all that low implication land area, the 3,400 acres, plus about a third of the total resource potential area, which gives it the highest exceedance flag of a level 5. And then if we look at the connectivity criteria alignment level, the connectivity area of the high connectivity area is about 20,000 acres, and that leaves about 25,000 for low connectivity area. And so the allocated megawatts of about 20,000 acres would take up about 80% of the low connectivity areas. So this plus, again, the total, so the amount of area that the allocated capacity takes up, as well as just the percentage of the high connectivity acreage with the total resource potential area. Those two factors together bring this category of connectivity to a level 4 flag. So this is just an example. Those are just kind of in-depth examples of the geospatial analysis that was performed for all of substations, and these are 3 examples of substations that were selected. And so now we'll just try to more broadly describe the geospatial analysis for the land use and environmental metrics. And again, a lot of these results are coming from the preliminary dashboard results that are linked to here. So this chart here, you can see the substations for solar in the SPG&E region for the 2039 proposed portfolio. And these are the factors that are kind of considered for the main land use feasibility metrics that we calculated. So you can see the total resource potential area, the low implication area, and the allocated capacity, the area equivalent of that. And so we have these calculations for, and here this is for the 10-mile radius around all of these substations in the SPG&E area. And you can see in all cases, the allocated capacity is less than the low implication area. So that's already a good indication that it won't raise a exceedance flag, that these substations would be in compliance according to our alignment assessment. But other areas, if we look at other areas like the greater Tehachapi region or greater Kramer areas, they're much more constrained with the amount of low implication land available. But you can see here, you can see one other characteristic of these substations the geospatial results at a 10-mile radius. And that is these substations that are highlighted in gray. The allocated capacity is actually significantly less than the low implication area around the substation. So these in the final busbar mapping results, these substations actually used a smaller area of assessment, a 5-mile radius, because there was still sufficient area to support that allocated capacity in that smaller area of assessment. So here's just an example now of the environmental impact factors of those same SPG&E substations, but now we're looking at the ones that remained at a 10-mile buffer radius. And you can compare the proportion of each variable, like the high connectivity, high biodiversity, high irreplaceability, etc. You can compare that magnitude with the total resource potential acreage for each substation. So you can kind of see how, what's the makeup of the total resource potential area around each substation. And that, of course, feeds into the determining the alignment level. And then I also have plotted the allocated capacity for each of these substations, so you can see what kind of level of potential constraints that that acreage would face if it was going to be supported, if it was going to actually be built in this area. So yeah, so it's just wanted to show that more visually, and we could go through and do this to all the other regions of California and all the other substations that were selected in the portfolio, in the proposed portfolio. And so yeah, so then just in summary, I shared the in detail, just again, the geospatial and land use environmental methodology that was used to perform this assessment for busbar mapping. And we found that for solar, in general, the substations and their areas of intersection with the environmental and land use variables did not conflict with the allocated capacity. So generally speaking, there was a lot of, alignment levels that were in line. Not a lot of exceedances were raised, but Greater Tehachapi and Greater Kramer were the exceptions. For wind, there was a higher tendency of the allocated capacity to conflict with the land use and environmental characteristics. And a lot of this was due to the lower, the limited amount of lower implication land that's available throughout the state. And for geothermal, I shared kind of the land use and environmental methodology that we used to assess the characteristics and this was for the areas within the geothermal fields. And then that information would be used on the substations nearby. So yeah, so that's it. Yeah, I'll stop here.
Thanks for that, Sophia. So as we're transitioning to the next part of the presentation, I'll just note a couple more housekeeping things and then some clarification on some items that are still lingering in the Q&A. So Safia, Femi, and a few others on the panel, you do have some questions in the Q&A. To break the fourth wall a little bit, attendees, as you're submitting questions in the Q&A, we do get the chance to assign them to people. Unfortunately, we're figuring out that you don't get to see when your question's been assigned or who it's been assigned to. So we've gotten some questions separately in the chat that ask, hey, is my question going to be answered? The answer is yes, that we're aiming to get to all questions by noon, but if we can't, they will all be answered in time for us to post the full Q&A transcript on our website like we have with other webinars like this one. So I guess I'll repeat, we aim to get to every question, but if we don't, we will get an answer in the version of the Q&A transcript that we post on the website too. Regarding process, there still seem to be a couple questions out there on where we are in the process and where we're going. So to try to reiterate, the results that we showed earlier today, particularly what Jared covered, are the same as what we had back in October, just with a little bit more detail. Shortly, we're going to cover some material that could lead to potential changes for what might eventually make it in the proposed decision that we aim to have voted on in the February CPUC voting meeting. We're going to consider today's feedback and other information at hand, comments, replies, etc., in trying to finish that mapping and aim to get the base case mapping results in the PD itself. And hopefully that provides you the visibility and is the clarity that you need to interact with our process as well as you need to going forward. Sorry if we were less than clear about that earlier in the presentation. And with that, I think we can pivot over to some more mapping material. And I can hand things back to Jared for the next couple minutes.
Hello again, everyone, and thanks, Sophia, for walking through the details of how the environmental and land use analysis are calculated and utilized. It segues nicely into this next section where I'm going to be presenting on the criteria alignment for the mapped resources that I presented before Sophia's talk, and identifying at a high level where we've identified misalignment. We have the criteria from level 1 to level 5, where we have level 1 and 2 being excellent and good alignment with our criteria. We have 3 being in the middle, some alignment, some potential misalignment, and then we have 4 and 5, which are growing levels of misalignment with our criteria. So with that, we're going to jump into some summary of the analysis for the criteria alignment for the land use and environmental criteria. So next slide, please. So in the dashboard that was released after the workshop, we had the individual substation and resources criteria alignment like Sophia was showing. So for the 50 megawatts at Olive, you could see those implications. I'm trying to show here sort of some higher regional area summaries of alignment. So what this chart and some subsequent chart will show are resolved resource areas. So we have Northern California on down to the greater Imperial, where we have mapped solar, wind, and geothermal resources. And this is looking at sort of that substation by substation analysis and trying to amalgamate it. So the first set of columns are the core land use screen. So that's just one data set, one criterion analysis. And this is summarizing how many resources mapped to that region are at a substation with either level 1 or 2 or a level 3, 4, or 5 criteria alignment with that core land use screen. So just a quick example here in Northern California, you see for solar in the 2039 mapping results, we have about 560 megawatts of solar mapped to substations that have good alignment with that one or 2 under the core land use screen. You have 230 megawatts, which is at one substation at that middle level 3 alignment, and then you have 400 megawatts of solar mapped to a substation that has the level 4 misalignment with that core land use green. And then I've just noted here that that substation is the 400 megawatts mapped to the Tesla substation. In the subsequent section of columns, we have the other land use criteria for solar. We had multiple other land use criteria that we implement. We had the parcelization, we had the CEC's cropland index, and we had fire threat as well. And so this is looking at across those multiple criteria, what was the highest flag. And so it's sorting those by that highest flag. So for example, again, in Northern California, we have most of the, or just over half of the resources, solar resources, 680 megawatts at substations, where those three core criteria have all level 1 or 2 flags. And then you have 512 megawatts mapped to substations that have a level 3 flag in at least one of those categories. We are highlighting here sort of the highest flag out of those categories. And then I note here that level 3 is actually a level 3 at a few substations. At one substation, it's for the fire threat criteria, and then at another substation, it's at it's a result of the cropland index analysis. And then similarly, in the last set of columns, you have the environmental core criteria. So those are the ACE data sets, the connectivity, the intactness, the diversity, and then also you have the wetlands as well. And again, it's looking at what of those 5 sets of analyses, what is the highest flag of those. So you can see here again for Northern California, we have 767 megawatts at substations that have at least one level 3 flag, and sort of the key issues or the key criteria that are driving that level 3 flag are the connectivity and also the irreplaceability data sets. So this is sort of a quick way, instead of looking at a spreadsheet of 500 substations with we have it for multiple resources. This is sort of a quick way to highlight sort of where and which substations do have potential or strong misalignment with the criteria. And so if we look at sort of after Northern California, that was a relatively straightforward summary. If we just go going down, you can see Southern PG&E in 2039, we have over 7 gigawatts of solar mapped into the Central Valley, the PG&E, Kern, and Fresno study areas combined. And you can see there that most of it is under 1 or 2 for both the core land use green and also the other land use and environmental criteria. The key for the core land use green, what most of those 2,000 megawatts of solar are at the midway and Gates substations, where we're seeing the amount of solar mapped is utilizing a good chunk of that low potential implication. And then you also see that we have about 2.5 gigawatts of solar that's either at level 3 for parcelization, so that's that moderate parcelization level of land being used, or you see that it's the amount of solar at the substation is using a significant portion of the cropland in that location. But again, those are the level 3 compliance, not sort of misalignment. It's sort of that middle ground that could be improved potentially, but not a big misalignment. It's sort of it's sort of right there in the middle. And then so moving down to Greater Tehachapi, we have about just over 4.3 gigawatts of solar map there. Again, you can see on the core land use screen, it's mostly in good alignment with the criteria. WinHub is the one substation that has that level 3 alignment. On the land use screens, you can see that all the solar are in the level 5 category, and that is predominantly due to parcelization. There is one sub in that sort of SCE northern area north of Gundan that has some fire threat, but predominantly it's the parcelization in the Tehachapi area that is triggering those level 5 flags for the solar in the Tehachapi. In the greater Kramer area, you're seeing across that, you see sort of like in Northern California, you have one substation with 649 megawatts mapped to it that has that level 4 criteria misalignment for the core land. And Sophia was showing earlier how Kramer in particular, with sort of where the limited amount of low implication resource potential is, it's sort of up in that northwest corner. So you're seeing that level 4 flag in that greater Kramer area. On the land use side, again, it's parcelization is the key level 5 flag for a few substations in that north of Lugo greater Kramer area. And sort of on the environmental side, you have a few substations with level 3 flags that is predominantly driven by level 3 flags in the connectivity, the ACE connectivity data set analysis. Riverside is one of the areas where we are noticing some significant non-compliance. You can see about half of the resources in Riverside, it's the resources mapped to Red Bluff, have a level 5 compliance, and then the resources mapped to Colorado River have that level 3 compliance. And then sort of you can see that is also reflected. You see that 4 and 5 compliance, and those are both related to utilization of cropland. And I'll discuss the Red Bluff and Colorado River more in a bit. I'm just going to keep going through the rest of these summaries. In Arizona and Southern Nevada, because they're out of state, we currently don't have sort of the complete data analysis sets that we have from CEC staff for the in-state resources. So we have a core land use screen that is based on the WEC land use and cultural implication data set that are environmental land use and cultural implication data set we have implemented, but we don't have the additional data sets for that. But so for Arizona and Southern Nevada, you have one substation in Southern Nevada, and it's for solar, and it's the El Dorado substation that has a level 3 compliance thing. And then finally, we don't have much solar in the ISO area of the Greater Imperial. It's only at one substation at the East County, and you see the sort of the one area of greater than 1 or 2 alignment is for the fire threat at that location. And so overall, you see we have a generally good alignment with the criteria for solar resources. We have sort of a few key substations that we are looking at for sort of reassessment, potential remapping. And if you can go to the next slide, please. And here we're going to talk about those sort of implications. The first one I want to bring up is the high parcelization for the Tehachapi solar. So we generally feel like this is a known feature of the Tehachapi area. It is highly partialized, particularly compared to the desert areas or even the Central Valley areas. And so we sort of, when we were reviewing and developing the parcelization data set, CEC and CPUC staff, we recognize that we may have this sort of issue with how the parcellation is scaled, particularly for the Tehachapi area. So we recognize that this is a feature in the Tehachapi area, and it hasn't seriously limited recent developments in the Tehachapi area for solar. So we don't view it as serious of a flag as, you know, maybe the level 5 criteria implies. For the Riverside area, we have the high cropland utilization at both Colorado River and Red Bluff. At Red Bluff, that high cropland, that level 5 cropland utilization is in our artifact that we have only a tiny amount of farmland picked up in the data set. So sort of like, I think it's 12 acres, or it's a small amount. And so that sort of flag is artifact of the way we're calculating that feature. At Colorado River, however, you do have a significant acreage of farmland that the mapping could impact, and so that we are looking at assessing that potential implications and whether or not it warrants remapping. The next point sort of is all the level 3 or the level 3 alignments. These are sort of ones that, like I said, they're in the middle of the road. They're not ideal. They're not sort of misaligned. So we are still going to look at these just to assess, you know, if there are potentially other substations that have better siting criteria, but still also have commercial interest and transmission availability. So those also could potentially get remapped. But it's not a urgent priority for those because they're still within our acceptable range of our criteria. Next slide, please. So focusing in again on sort of two key substations with that high core land screen non-compliance, and that's Red Bluff, which is at that level 5, and the amount of solar there significantly exceeds the amount of low implication land, and so it warrants a potential remap of the at least the amount of generic resources that are mapped there. We do have a fair amount of in development resources, so those would not be remapped, but sort of the additional resources being mapped to Red Bluff are being considered for remapping. The Kramer substation, which has that level 4 not compliance with the core landing screen, that's, as Sophia was saying, is due to that limited amount of low impact potential on the northwest side. And in this area, we have two options. That analysis was conducted looking 15 miles out, and noting that if with the amount mapped to Kramer, we have a fair amount mapped, that it could be cost effective to warrant, you know, siting solar slightly further away. So looking out 20 miles would reduce that would increase the amount of low implication land that's within range for solar. So that's one option. The other option is to remap some of the solar resources at that area. The level 3 compliance stations, like I said, there's key sort of ones that have a fair amount of solar, Wind Hub, Midway, and Gates. Those could have some resources remapped, particularly as we're looking and seeing if there's substations that have high confidence commercial interest that we haven't also mapped to and have available transmission capacity. And sort of generally where we are looking for those remaps are sort of two of the areas where we have generally good alignment with these environmental and land use criteria, and also have a fair amount of commercial interest. And those are the southern PG&E area, that Central Valley area, as well as southern Nevada. Both areas have some substations with lower potential implications and high amounts of commercial interest. Next slide, please. So here is a similar chart for the in-state wind resources. Note that a few things that we don't have these data sets available for the Baja California wind in Mexico. So that wind does not have this in analysis. And then the second thing I want to note is that under other land use criteria, the one date we don't assess partialization or cropland utilization. So the one key data set we have for that in this category is only fire threat. So it's essentially that middle column section is only for fire threat, while as for everything else, it's the same. And overall, you can see with the wind resources, we have significantly more 4 and 5 alignment flags sort of across most regions, both in the core land use screen and also in the environmental criteria. You can see in sort of in Northern California and in the Riverside area and in the greater Imperial area, the majority of the wind mapped to those areas are at substations with level 4 and 5 criteria flags. Whereas you have sort of the greater Tehachapi, the greater Kramer, and then southern Nevada area as having generally lower flags, but still a fair amount of 3 and some 4 and 5s as well. Next slide, please. So as I was saying, sort of we have overall of the resources we have this analysis for wind, we have roughly half the megawatts mapped have the level 4 or 5. And I spoke to this briefly towards the start, is sort of one of the issues where we are observing is that at some substations, we have level 5 criteria because we have no wind resource potential. Our base map has no wind resource potential in those areas. So there is this potential misalignment of that base resource potential, given that we do have identified commercial interest through the interconnection queue at that area. Next slide. So one of the things, as I mentioned earlier, we are considering is we currently for our base potential. So the base potential is based off of the NREL wind toolkit data, and we apply a 28% capacity factor from the wind speed data as a minimum threshold. So that gets immediately, so areas below that threshold get screened out immediately. Then after that is when the protected layers and also the CEC's environmental and land use analysis gets applied on. So, and we had a fair amount of discussion about that during the inputs and assumption process. But so what we're at here for this busbar mapping is sort of a look at particularly these areas that do have commercial interest, and where we're seeing sort of this no resource potential, is looking at a lower capacity factor for a threshold for that initial screen, and then applying the same environmental and land use screens on top of that, because we sort of recognize the limitations in coarseness of those base screen assumptions. So this is one factor that staff are considering to better assess where wind potential is located in the state. And then I'll note just again that we are still reviewing and assessing and assessing how to implement proposals from the recent ruling comment and replies, and there are some suggestions that related to this onshore in-state wind issue that we are seeing here, and so we also are reviewing those comments and recommendations. Next slide. So for the last set of analysis we do for land use and environmental monitoring is for geothermal, and we have only about half of our geothermal located in state. So we only have analysis for those resources. And so you can see here, as Sophia was saying, the geothermal analysis isn't done by substation, it's done by geothermal area. And so sort of have here how much how many megawatts of geothermal are mapped to sort of these specific geothermal areas. And you see we have 120 at the geysers area interconnecting to multiple substations in that area. We have about 740 megawatts in the Salton Sea known geothermal area, and then 50 megawatts in a known geothermal area just for further south in Imperial. And overall, you see we have generally good alignment with our land use and environmental criteria. You see in the geyser area, you do have a fire threat flag, and also you have a level 3 alignment with the data set that combines all the ACE screens together. So it's sort of the most restrictive data set. You do see a level 3 compliance there. And as we're looking at sort of where to site all of the geothermal resources in the portfolio, and if the out of state in particular resources are the transmission solutions could potentially be not cost effective. You know, one alternative that the working group could implement is actually shifting more resources into a few of these geothermal areas. But again, we also have to factor in the transmission implications, like the Salton Sea area also has its own transmission implications, and also factor in commercial interest of where we're seeing for projects in development queues. So we have to balance all the criteria. Next slide. I'll quickly want to note our criteria flags. I had the table on the right in the previous workshop in October that shows sort of where that first round of mapping had resources located at its proximity to gas plants, its proximity to disadvantaged communities. One thing I'll note is that as we're implementing our proposed gas capacity not retained mapping process, we will look to assess sort of how does mapping, particularly storage, but also renewable resources, how can we potentially, if needed, tweak the resource mapping to better align with that process. And then on the bottom here, I just want to note sort of this was new for this cycle, is we did do this analysis for where we were mapping biomass plants. And so you can see here we had of about 120 megawatts were mapped to substations that were greater than 5 miles from a disadvantaged community, while you have about 40 or so megawatts of biomass that are located near or in a disadvantaged community. So we are looking to see if we can remap at least the generic portion of that biomass to substations that are not in disadvantaged communities. I'll note that about 17 megawatts of those resources are in development resources, so those cannot be moved. Next slide. So that was the rundown of the environmental societal impacts in land use criteria. I'm now going to switch over to the commercial interest criteria analysis for these resources. I'll just note sort of this table here shows the amount of resources in the ISO interconnection queue by sort of where it is in the process. We have resources in the queue that have TBD allocated, have executed IA, and I've also shown on the right here a not fully incorporation of the cluster for 15 interconnection requests. We're still working on fully implementing it. The substation nomenclature is different than what's in the interconnection queue and is different than what we have. So it takes a while to fully implement it, but we have most of it. I mean, we have the 250 gigawatts. So we have that shown here as well. For solar and battery, there is generally way more solar and battery commercial interest than we have resources in the portfolio. And we actually, in some situations, particularly in like the 2034 mapping, we actually have more higher confidence commercial interest for solar and storage than we do have resources in the portfolio. Next slide. So this table here is once again trying to take the big list of substation analyses in the dashboard of the criteria and trying to simplify it into a smaller, easier to digest table. And so what this table has for solar and storage resources, it has again a breakdown this time. I know I'm flipping back and forth, but it's easier to implement it. This time the breakdown is by the ISO interconnection zone. And what it has is the number of substations that we have resources mapped to, where the criteria showed we have more megawatts mapped than there are commercial interest. So you have sort of two columns for solar. You have substations where we have solar mapped and there's no commercial interest, and then substations where we have solar mapped and the amount mapped exceeds the amount of higher confidence commercial interest. So it's not exceeding the total amount of commercial interest, but it exceeding that higher confidence amount. We have the same thing for batteries, sort of the no commercial interest and the higher confidence. And then we have the opposite side of the analysis, where we have the substations where we have the amount of commercial interest at that substation is exceeding the amount mapped. Again, we sort of saying if there's more high confidence commercial interest and then also more total commercial interest. And you can see sort of as a quick view is we have only a few substations. We have two for solar, two for storage where we have no commercial interest. And then we have about 34 substations where we are exceeding the higher confidence commercial interest, but not the total. So those particularly those four, but those four substations with no commercial interest, but then also those 34 are the substations we are looking at to assess if it warrants remapping resources from those substations to one of the over 200 substations that have more commercial interest. So this is sort of that key alignment with commercial interest criteria for solar and storage. Next slide. This is a summary of the in-state wind resources. So the table on the right shows in that blue column the amount mapped by California or ISO interconnection zone. And then the next column's the total commercial interest. And you can see we've pulled the total commercial interest from the ISO queue, the cluster 15 applications, and also for looking at that as the Eastern Sierras, that Northeast California area we're looking at, and also the Southern Nevada area, looking at the Nevada energy queue at what locations, what areas have commercial interest in those queues. Overall, you do see we have more resources in the portfolio than total commercial interest, and the mapping alignment is additionally not fully aligned with that commercial interest. So we do have 7 substations, about 1.4 gigawatts of resources mapped that have no commercial interest. and then 3 substations have some like a smaller wind project identified in the queues, but we have mapped significantly more portfolio resources to that location. Sort of here, I notice how we're not perfectly aligned because we do have 3 substations that have more of that low confidence commercial interest than we map to those. So you have the Devers substation has additional interest from the cluster 15 application. That is an area as sort of in the land use analysis side where we're seeing there's hardly any resource potential in that area. So that was at the time why we did not map more there. Similarly, in the cluster 15, you have a wind project interconnecting at Metcalf. We weren't seeing any resource potential in that area. And then lastly, you have about 500 megawatts, a bit more than that, of more resources in Baja California, Mexico, interconnecting at the East County substation. Next slide. On the sort of two other key areas on the geothermal side of things, I'll note there is very little geothermal projects in the ISO queue. There's 1 project, but in both the IID queue for the Imperial area and the Nevada Energy queue, we have about 1 gigawatt each for both those areas. And so that's one of the reasons you see in our mapping of geothermal, we have most of our geothermal mapped to either Imperial area or various parts of Nevada. On the long duration energy storage, we've mapped about 1,000 megawatts of long duration energy storage to 2 locations. We've mapped to Whirlwind in the Tehachapi because that aligns with a project identified in the ISO queue that also has been partially contracted by LSEs. And then also we have the other 500 mapped to Sycamore Canyon in the San Diego area to align with a pumped storage per project that is in planning and development in that area. And next slide. So this gets to our penultimate criteria of alignment with the previous TPP. I talked a little bit about this at a higher level at the start. I'm going to go into a little more detail in certain areas of the state about this. Again, overall, sort of across the portfolio, the key alignment is just the fact that there is less solar and storage in this portfolio. So you have in the net analysis a lot of substations where we either aren't mapping solar in this portfolio or are mapping less solar than was mapped previously, particularly in the 2034 portfolio when there's about roughly half as much solar than in the 2035 portfolio for the last TPP. Some other reasons to see these misalignment in the portfolio is we have new and updated land use and environmental screens from the CEC. So that does sort of identify areas where it's not as ideal for development. One example of this sort of with sort of the land use and environmental impact is in the southern Nevada area around the Mojave area. There's been declared a new national monument that affects some of the development, the previously included development area around the Mojave substation. So that's resulted in a shift in resources in that location. And then this last point is not so much a shifting of resources, it just is a shifting of sort of the name of the substation that resource is interconnecting to. So we have the new white paper, which has a lot more substations included in the analysis, and we've also included a few proposed substations based on the ISO study of the interconnection queue. So in some cases where, you know, we might have resources mapped to a substation, you know, we'll say it's midway, we now sort of can better align it with the commercial interests and where it would more likely get developed at a new substation that's being built on the midway to Wheeler Ridge line. So that has also resulted, and that sort of still has similar transmission implications. It's just in the accounting and criteria analysis, you do see flags pop up because of that. So now I'm going to sort of go through a few of the key areas that we have some of the differences. So in Northern California, you know, we do, again, in 2034, you see the pronounced difference. We have about half as many resources in 2034 as the previous TPP portfolio. And that's driven by both the not having offshore wind mapped to the North Coast and also about 1 gigawatt less solar. You see those differences. The total difference gets more comparable in 2039, but it's a significantly different resource mix of onshore wind and a little bit more storage rather than offshore wind and solar. Next slide. In the Central Valley area, the PG&E and Kern interconnection zones, you see a similar thing layout in 2034, where you have significantly less solar and storage in both areas in the 2034 mapping. However, by the 2039 mapping, the amount of solar and storage in actually both areas is roughly the same. In the current area, it's still a few hundred megawatts less, but it's roughly the same. And additionally, you see that there is more offshore wind mapped to the Morro Bay wind area interconnecting in the PG&E Kern area as well. Next slide. In the Southern California area, looking at the Tehachapi, LA, and Greater Kramer area, you have the Tehachapi area, which is following similar step as the Southern PG&E area, where in 2034 you have significantly less solar and storage. However, unlike in the SPG areas, in 2039 you still on the solar side have about 2 gigawatts less solar in the Tehachapi area, and that goes back to just the general portfolio resource mix composition. In the metro area, you actually have a little bit more batteries mapped in the metro area in 2034 and in 2039, while in the Greater Kramer area, you have sort of just it's probably the region that's most similar to the previous TPP. You do have a few hundred megawatts less resources in solar and storage in 2034, but then you have a little bit more in 2039. Next slide. In the other half of the Southern California area, I'm sounding a little bit like a broken record, but again, it's the amount of solar resources. So in both east of Pisgah area and the SC Eastern area, you have in 2034 about half as much solar and about 1 gigawatt less battery in both areas. By 2039, the battery amounts are roughly similar, but they still have significantly less solar. In the SDG&E area, you see a similar situation where the battery amounts are roughly comparable, but you do have less solar. And then across all these interconnection zones, you do have significantly more wind, both in-state wind, in ISO wind in Baja California, in Southern Nevada, and also you have that out-of-state wind interconnecting in the Harry Allen El Dorado area for East Pisgah, and then interconnecting at the Palo Verde area. in SCE Eastern area. The next slide. So for the last and sort of I say this the last because it's sort of the key output of the busbar mapping process is sort of trying to assess through when we pass the portfolio to the ISO, they do their transmission analysis through the TPP to assess what transmission upgrades are needed. So in our busbar mapping process, we do try to have a course assessment of what upgrades could be triggered or are likely to be triggered by our mapping, and do some assessments of whether or not we should try to avoid triggering or be that certain upgrade because it's not cost effective, it would be underutilized, or there's existing transmission capacity in another part of the region. So this table here in the top right shows of the 104 or so transmission constraints we have from the 2023 white paper, how many are exceeded by the mapping results. So this, you see there, the first two columns are 2034 exceedances, and then the next two columns are 2039 exceedances. So you can see in both 2034 and 2039, most of the actual exceedances are in either the PG&E area or in the San Diego area, and this corresponds to what we have the information for transmission, because in the 2022-23 TPP, there were approved significant upgrades in the Southern California area, and so we have incorporated capacity estimates from the ISO of those upgrades, and so those are not considered exceedances in that, because they're assumed to be included in the base transmission by the time we're looking at this in 2034 and 2039. I will note, you will see in 2039 in particular in the SCE area and even in the SDG area, you see an increase in default exceedances. So these are in the SCE area in particular, these are the constraints sort of from Devers or Devers, I forget how I'm supposed to say that after we talked about that this morning, through over to like Colorado River. So in the 22-23 TPP, there was a series of smaller upgrades approved for that section. And so what we're seeing in 2039 in particular, with the large amount of out-of-state wind interconnecting at Palo Verde, and to a lesser extent also the amount of wind connecting into El Dorado and Harry Allen, you're seeing that we're having exceedances of those, the capacities provided for those upgrades. So we don't have additional. So that's one thing we are sort of going to be working with ISO staff to assess, sort of like, are we expecting sort of an additional, like, what's the potential cost or need of an additional upgrade beyond those upgrades in those areas. And then the last half of this table on the right shows sort of what I'm calling likely upgrades. So these are sort of constraints where we have a large number of resources causing the exceedance. So it's like, we're exceeding the constraint by a couple thousand megawatts or things like that. So we're sort of clearly exceeding. There is going to be a constraint issue, sort of like, and so I've listed those sort of the number in each area, sort of what the white paper shows as their capability to increase capacity in that constraint, and then also the total cost estimates from the white paper there. So you can see that you have in 2039, you have sort of one upgrade identified as likely being triggered by these mapping results in the Northern California. You have two in the Central Valley. You have one in the East Piscot area, and then you have 3 smaller upgrades in the San Diego area. And then the rightmost column, so the other 11 constraints that are exceeded are ones that we need to do further analysis and get hopefully additional information and feedback from the ISO. In some cases, though, those exceedances are small. Like we have 1,000 megawatts mapped to that area, and it's triggering only like a 10 megawatt exceedance. So we want to assess if you know that is likely to trigger transmission or not. And in often cases, we also want more information on the potential transmission upgrades, because you have in a few locations, in a few, particularly in the PG&E, Kern, and Fresno area, you have fairly expensive upgrades that don't provide a large amount of additional capacity. So these areas we will be seeking more information from the ISO staff of what's available and whatnot, and also we'll be doing assessment of if we need to remap resources from this area so we're not causing exceedances in this area. And that's also impactful of, are there other locations to remap to that still align with our criteria and also have better transmission availability. Next slide, please. And so this is sort of just noting that what I was just talking about, and sort of noting the idea that we are going to be working with the ISO to better understand these exceedances and their potential impacts. Next slide. And then, so we'll transition there to Nathan introducing us to the gas capacity not retained.
So thanks for all of that information, Jared. Your Q&A queue is now rich with even more questions while you were presenting. Thanks to all for the good thinking that went into your questions. So we're going to transition to the last part of this morning's session by kind of drawing a distinction between all the material that we've been presenting so far, which pertains to the proposed base case, and now towards the sensitivity case and something that actually quite specific about the proposed sensitivity. So recall that our October 5th ruling materials contained a proposal for a high gas retirement sensitivity to be studied in 24-25 TPP. And that case has not yet had a methodology described for it for determining a key feature of the portfolio itself, which is which plants would be shown as offline or retired, quote unquote, in CAISO's analysis, should it be the case that gets studied by them. So we want to acknowledge a couple of things, just framing wise and even optics wise going into this, before Jared takes over with some of the more technical material, which is we realize we've called it a gas retirement case, but we also want to acknowledge the limited nature of CPUC's jurisdiction as it relates to actually retiring plants. We acknowledge that we don't have the authority to point to a specific plant and have it retire. But what we're trying to do here is develop and adopt portfolios that are meant to realize certain futures that address certain state goals, such as decreases in GHG or other emissions, while maintaining reliability, assuming the possibility that certain plants wouldn't be around to meet those goals. And in order to decide which plants to show as offline in the sensitivity, we've developed some criteria that we'd like to share with you in the coming slides, along with some kind of high-level what-if results if those criteria were applied at least a class level, because we are not going to be at the point of actually naming the bus bars or the plants themselves for some time. Just a reminder that the actual bus bar level results, again, are not a part of today's webinar, and you'll get a chance to look at them at a later date. So I think I can hand back to Jared.
Thanks, Nathan. And so we have about 10 slides on this. And so if you go to the next slides, please, I'm gonna do a quick recap again on the amount of gas capacity not contained in both the base case, because it does have some gas capacity not retained, and also the high gas retirement sensitivity. So this table on the bottom shows those amounts where we have both OTC and CHP phase outs built into the default inputs and assumptions for these portfolios. And then the base case resolve selects 2.1 gigawatts of economic capacity not retained when building the portfolios. And then in the sensitivity, we have forced in 4.6 gigawatts of retirement by 2034, and then 10.5 gigawatts of retirement by 2039. Next slide. So the criteria we are incorporating is a range of criteria of both environmental and pollution impacts, as well as efficiency and performance related data. And we're basically giving scores per factor and using the overall score to sort of, and we can weight each factor as well, and then use the overall score to prioritize which resources to model as offline in the portfolio. And so the factors we are considering is the proximity to disadvantaged communities. So we are giving the highest score for prioritizing for this category plants in disadvantaged communities, and then have the next highest priority of near disadvantaged communities, and then so on down. For NOx emissions, we have 2018 emissions data from the EIA database, and we're using a quartile system to rank the NOx rate times the capacity factor with those plants in the highest quartile receiving the highest score, and so on and so down. We're incorporating the EPA's ozone and PM 2.5 non-attainment zones. So plants that are in both the highest non-attainment levels for both pollutants have the highest score in that category. We're also incorporating age of plants, and we're looking at sort of the age it will be in the year we're studying, so 2035 or 2039, with the highest score going to the older plants. Next slide. The last three sets of information we're incorporating is we are looking at the heat rate and capacity factor of the plant. So we're again just looking at sort of the quartile analysis of where. So is it in the top quarter of the heat rate or capacity factors? We also, this is a sort of a slightly different one where it's just like yes or no. We also are looking at resources that aren't under contracts through the date in which we are modeling, and so we are incorporating this, but when we do release data, this information will not be included in it. We are though factoring it in, and then finally we are incorporating the local efficiency factor, which plants in LCR areas will have from the most recent CAISO's LCR studies, and we're prioritizing sort of giving the highest rank again to plants with low or no efficiency factor. And so those are the roughly 7-8 criteria we are incorporating into this analysis. And so next slide, please. So these next few slides are sort of just a data summary of what plants within the ISO master generating list that we have the information for are under these categories. So you can see here, this is showing those initial three environmental societal impact categories of sort of, you have the leftmost column is how many plants we have in the ISO, and then you have the second column is how many are in or near DAC. Then you sort of have the comparison of how many of those total plants are in the top 2 quartile of NOx emissions. Then you also have how many plants are in those highest non-attainment zones. And then lastly, just to show you how much those 3 categories overlap, I've included how many plants in their megawatts are within all 3 of those classifications. Next slide. So this is sort of showing it on the on some additional information. On the left is sort of is the plants by LCR area, and just noting that one of the categories is not in LCR, and so that's just the plants that are at the ISO system level and not in one of the ISO identified local areas. The right graph breaks down the plants by technology type and also by age in 2035. And this is, I'll note, is a subset of the plants that are only in or near disadvantaged communities. So you can see that that first column is the CCGTs in and near disadvantaged communities. Then you have mostly the peakers that are in or near disadvantaged communities, and then the CHPs. And then the green color bar are the oldest, and then the blue bar at the top are the youngest plants. Next slide. This is, again, just some of the plants in the system and how they fit within the data. So on the left, we have all the plants sort of broken down by age in color bar, and also where they fit in the heat rate quartile, and also the capacity factor quartile. So on the left 3 columns, in the first you have the top 25% highest heat rate, and you can see those plant ages there. The second is the second highest 25%. The third column is the third highest, or second from the lowest 25%. So you can see the breakdown of age and megawatts that fit within each of those quartiles. On the right side, you have the fourth column in this chart from left to right is those plants in the highest capacity factor, the amount of megawatts in age. You have the second highest quartile of capacity factor ranking, and then the last is, again, a combination of if it's in the top 2 quartiles, so if it's in either the first column or the second column, as well as being in the 4th or 5th column. So it's just showing sort of how much of an overlap there is between those 2 categories. And then on the right side, you can see the same analysis of heat rate and capacity factor, but by plant type. Next slide. So this is, like I said, so this is sort of just the overview of the criteria and sort of what the current system looks like. And this is just an example selection of choosing 10.5 gigawatts, which is roughly the amount that's in the gas retirement sensitivity. And this is using a balanced approach of the criteria. As I mentioned earlier, we could weight the criteria differently. We could weight the scores for DAC and the NOx emissions, age, or we could weight heat rate or more. But this is assuming roughly equal weight across all the criteria. So generally, just what has the highest score overall. I will note that we did sort of, when there were ties, particularly in that sort of getting down to how to get the full 10.5 gigawatts, we did, when sort of plants had roughly similar scores. In this example, the tiebreaker was having higher environmental criteria, so the DAC, the NOx emission, or the non-attainment zones. And I'll also note that this sort of breakdown only does not focus on the CHP resources, because I'll note that in both the base case and in the sensitivity, we will be mapping most of the CHPs by 2039 as not being retained. So this is focusing on those that 10.5 gigawatts of additional gas capacity that needs to be identified. So this on the right shows the breakdown of those 10.5 gigawatts of how they fall into the various criteria. So you can see the total on the left, we have most of those are in or near DACs. You can see also we have a majority of them are in the higher quartiles of NOx emissions and also are in those highest non-attainment zones. And then on the middle analysis shows those heat rate and capacity factor scores. How many of the plants show up in the as top scores in those, and then in the last three columns you have the where they show up for in the age criteria, age in 2039 criterion. And again, this is for the peakers and CCGTs only, not the CHP analysis. The next slide is showing, this table on the right is showing the breakdown by LCR area. So you can see the plurality is in the ISO system, and then you have about 3 gigawatts that are in the LA basin, with then about 1.2 gigawatts in the Bay Area LCR area. And then the table on the bottom shows the comparison of that 10.5 gigawatts breakdown to the most recent ISO 20-year outlook, because in that they looked at modeling about 14.5 gigawatts as offline, and so you can see their breakdown on the left, and then this sample mapping on the right, and just noting sort of the key sort of difference is that in the Bay Area, sort of the amount, whereas that was the highest amount in the ISO, this is sort of our third highest amount of retirements are in the Bay Area. And that wraps up this sort of quick little presentation of the proposed criteria in a sample way of using those criteria to identify the 10.5 gigawatts in that sensitivity case.
Thanks for all that, Jared. And thanks everyone for the many questions that have been coming into the Q&A. It's actually been very detailed in a lot of ways. We're getting close to the number of questions and the amount of detail in questions that we did in the workshop on October 20th, which was workshopping a considerably larger or more broad set of policy topics, whereas this more detailed exercise, I think naturally, though narrower than what we covered on October 20th, is producing lots and lots of detailed questions, which it's going to take us some time to get to. So we're 3 minutes from noon. I think I'll just apologize in advance that not every question is going to be answered in the next 3 minutes. We're going to do our best to provide really detailed, thoughtful responses in the coming days and post the transcript and the video of this workshop on the website in the place that Jared noted, I think, in his email announcement for the workshop. Jared, are there any parting thoughts that you would have for our group today?
I guess sort of just, this is sort of a recall back to our busbar mapping methodology, which we did have a workshop on the updates we went through earlier this year, but it's important to remember sort of like on this call, helping answering questions and presenting, we had staff from CEC and staff from ISO. So this is an inter-agency, inter-org process. And I did see a question in the chat talking about sort of like how CEC, it's an iterative process where we sort of get analysis and information from CEC and ISO, do some mapping, do the analysis of the criteria, and then sort of iterate again. We get additional information, ask additional questions to CEC and ISO staff, and hopefully get more information that improves the mapping. And that's sort of what we're in now, is we've been working with CEC to address and try to figure out solutions, alternatives to some of the environmental and land use criteria flags we're seeing. And we are working to get the same sort of feedback from ISO staff on the transmission implications and transmission exceedances. So this is a iterative, interactive between the two agencies and the ISO.
Great points, Jared. To that collaborative relationship, we really want to thank presenters and panelists that we had from those other organizations. So Safia, Erica from CEC, thank you. Nebu from CAISO, thank you. And then from our consultants, E3 and Montara Mountain Energy. I also want to address kind of some process points that we've seen in the last couple of minutes in the Q&A from Hillary and others saying, hey, don't you have more time or more process planned to workshop or stakeholder, if I can use that as a verb, some of the information that we'll have when mapping is a little bit more baked? And the answer for the case that we just went through is probably not. We're also seeing some questions regarding, hey, can you update given the newest IPR that's likely to be adopted right before the likely voting date for the related decision here? And the answer is very likely not. It's a very difficult fact that we kind of have to live with in California electricity resource planning, that we have processes that are iterative, they're ongoing, they talk to each other, we do a lot of collaboration, but sometimes we're going to come up with results that can't be immediately ported into the end of a process that's been going on for a couple of years now. Otherwise, we thank you for all your engagement so far, for the last 3 hours especially. Be on the lookout for us to post all the relevant materials that hopefully help you out in informing how you want to engage with the rest of this process. Thanks to everyone else for being with us and sticking with us during the process. Thanks to all the presenters. And I think with that, we can adjourn.